As we spoke about last week, we are now in the time frame where we call Bein HaMetzarim, between the streets, between Shiva Asar Tammuz, the 17th of Tammuz, and Tisha B'Av. And generally speaking, we know that this is a time of deep mourning that has been observed for almost 2,000 years now, over 2,000 years, since the destruction of the first bite, the second bite, et cetera, all the events that occurred at Tisha B'Av, as we spoke last week. And it's well worth to mention over here that as we're about to enter the final stages this week of the mourning period, which is deemed by the by the title, the Tisha Yamim, the 9 days. This, of course, is referencing between Rosh Chodesh Menachem Av until after Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av. The 9th of Av, as we discussed, is a time period which we commemorate not just the destruction of the first temple or the second temple, but of course, as we discussed, originally in the Torah, Tisha B'Av was the day that the spies came back from Eretz Israel and reported that devastating report, which made the Jewish people cry throughout that night. Hearing that it's impossible to enter this land is just too strong. It's even stronger than God. And as we discussed many times, what does it mean stronger than God? How can a people who saw all the miracles and experienced the Exodus, as well as the very same day that they cried, after hearing that report, they ate from the man that Hashem provided from heaven, and all the miracles that we've encountered from the time we went out of Egypt until that very moment, how can we say that there is something stronger than God? And even more so, we cried that night, and as the Torah says, Hashem responds, "You've tested me 10 times." Mind you, this is only a span of a year and a half. How is it possible that Hashem says, "Tonight you cried for nothing. Every year at this day, I will give you what you cried for," which then in turn culminated in all the destructions that we've experienced in Tisha B'Av. Aside from the destruction of the first temple and the second temple, we know after the destruction of the second temple, as a result of Bar Kokhba's rebellion, successful rebellion against the Romans, where Bar Kokhba, being a heroic general, that Rabbi Akiva himself deemed as Mashiach, led a successful rebellion driving the Romans out of Israel, which is a miracle. But then there was a turn, and as a result of that turn, the Romans came in and murdered all the inhabitants of Beitar. It's a massacre, leaving their bodies strewn, forbidding them to be buried for 15 years. Why would, and then of course, throughout history, as we discussed, there was the English expulsion, the French expulsion in Tisha B'Av, the Spanish Inquisition, the Nazis entered, the Germans entered World War I on Tisha B'Av, as well as in modern day, 2005, being pressured by the international body, Israel withdrew from Gaza. Back then it was called Gush Katif. It's a paradise, literally a paradise with shuls and schools and institutions, greenhouses, and entire infrastructure. And the original expulsion from Gush Katif was supposed to take place on Tisha B'Av, on the night of Av. It was deferred to a few days later, ultimately culminating in October 7th. Why would a good God condemn his people to suffer as a tradition? Shem says, tonight you cried for nothing. From here on out, throughout history, I'll give you what to cry about on Tisha B'Av. So we cried for nothing. Okay, that's a reason to condemn an entire history? What kind of a father does this? Mind you, it was a year and a half after Exodus. Effectively, we were just about a year and a half old as a people. So if a child cries for nothing when they're a year and a half years old, the father is going to condemn the child for a life of torture because something the child did when they're a year and a half? How does that make sense? But as we discussed in Shabbat, Hashem wasn't punishing us. Hashem was warning us. This type of crying is going to result in a history of defeatism. It wasn't, God forbid, a decree, as much as it was a plea. Wake up. With everything you've seen and everything you've experienced. You know, there are matters within Judaism that we have to deem as the Lord works in mysterious ways. Of course, each and every one of us, anachnu ma'aminim b'nei ma'aminim, every single Jew is faithful, essentially. And with all of this, each and every one of us can, if we just think a little bit and are sincere and truthful in our intentions, we'll notice that in our lives, each and every one of us experience many miracles, open miracles. Of course, the Talmud says, regarding the verse, which is from Tehillim, and we say this on Shabbat morning, for the one who performs miracles unto himself, for forever his kindness. And the Talmud interprets this to what type of miracles does Hashem perform unto himself. But the Talmud discusses that there are two types of miracles. There's a miracle that we consider to be an overt miracle. In other words, the suspension or the changing of nature. Being that nature is cyclical, it's repetitive, and when a miracle occurs, those natural forces change or are downright suspended. So there are those type of miracles that we recognize as miracles. But then there is an altogether loftier miracle, of which the Talmud comments, Ein Bal Hanes Makir Beniso. The one who experiences a miracle doesn't recognize that they experience a miracle. What type of a miracle is this? This is indeed a miracle. But it's a miracle that, rather than overwhelming nature, was absorbed in nature, and nature acted in a certain way that was indeed miraculous. But the one who encountered that miracle, being that nature didn't change any courses, or certainly it wasn't suspended, it was just a natural phenomena. The person could say, well, this isn't a miracle, this is nature. Or there are many times where something could have happened and the person doesn't even recognize that something could have happened. His life was saved, et cetera, et cetera. He doesn't even recognize this because nothing really happened. Not recognizing that there was in the background, in the process, this was an open miracle, but not one that he recognizes as such. In simple jargon, as Einstein put it, one can live as though everything is a miracle or nothing is a miracle. There's no in between. Because even the cyclical aspect of nature in itself is a miracle. Every aspect of nature is a miracle. Had we been any closer to the sun or further from the sun, the world couldn't exist. Had the gravitational revolution been any different, the world couldn't exist. I heard once from a student who was a pediatrician that when he entered medical school, he entered as an atheist. But coming out of it, he was a deep believer. Because the odds that a child is going to be born, Baruch Hashem, healthy, with 2 hands, 2 feet, 10 fingers, 10 toes, every single cell acting in the way it needs to in order to sustain life. For that to happen, the odds are astronomical that it'll repeat from baby to baby. In other words, from the heavenly bodies, the sun, the moon, the stars, the galaxies, to the cell atom within ourselves, everything's a miracle. Having said that, if we develop a little bit of a sensitivity and use a little bit of logic, each one of us could recognize that the miracles that we've experienced, and I'm not talking about the ultimately lofty miracles that we're not even aware of. I'm talking about miracles as humanity understands miracles, a change or a suspension of nature. Each one of us has mounds and mounds of empirical evidence in our lives. There are matters where we have to attribute to faith. Of course, all Judaism is predicated and founded upon faith. Because the greatest mind is still limited to itself. Whereas, in contrast, faith allows us to connect to God without adulterating Him, without without the need to understand Him, limiting Him to a limited mind. With faith, we're able to connect to Hashem in His essential form and accept Him for who He is, not what we need Him to be. But with all that, especially from a Chabad perspective, whereas the Baal Shem Tov, who founded Hasidism, taught that every one of us is essentially connected to Hashem through our neshamot, through our simple faith. Chabad brought this into the escape of the intellect and the emotions. Where yes, essentially everything, as we said, is predicated and founded upon faith, but it's important to internalize that, to try to, as best as possible, to understand what does it mean? How does it affect us? How do we affect reality and so on and so forth? But nevertheless, in our own lives, each and every one of us has mounds and mounds of empirical evidence that we don't have to attribute to faith. We've experienced it. We've seen it. We're living proofs of it. And at the same time, with all of that, we were 1.5 years old when we cried for nothing. Okay, we cried for nothing. A father of flesh and blood who's frustrated by his son, by his infant child's cry, is going to now condemn the child for a life of mourning. But then again, this is what Hashem is telling us. It wasn't a decree. It was a plea. So long as you deem yourself to be feeble and meek and allow for the world to overwhelm you, your history will unfortunately be wrought with calamities. If you don't know who you are, then inevitably you go to live a life of who you're not. And that life is not suitable for you, not spiritual, not a philosophical, not an intellectual, not an emotional, but altogether it's not truth for you. And for that reason, you're going to create all kinds of incongruencies in your history. For you to be able to achieve what you're here to achieve cannot be out of a state of feeling overwhelmed, nor of a state of sadness and crying and panic and anxiety and so on and so forth. You're my other half. Imagine a king whose wife or children are walking around like beggars, unsure of themselves, unsure of their status, at times even rejecting their status. Shun off their responsibilities that are born from their essential self. Hashem wasn't condemning us. Hashem was pleading with us, wake up. Live up to yourself. As we discussed from the Tzaddik HaKohen Rabinowitz of Lublin, just as a person has a continual mitzvah to have faith in Hashem, so too a person has a continual mitzvah to have faith in themselves. This is what psychology calls intrinsic self-worth. There's an animal aspect of that, intrinsic self-worth, and the godly aspect of it, which should be the commanding force in our lives, the guiding light in our lives, is that I'm essentially holy. I'm essentially powerful. This is what I'm given. that this is what I need, and this is where I need to introduce holiness, to create holiness, to transform the darkness. I'm not here to be overwhelmed by it. If I'm being overwhelmed by any incongruencies, it means that I am not perceiving and responding to these matters from a correct lens. And if that's going to happen, well, even on a psychological level, and we discussed it in the Coach and the Rabbi series, cause does not equal effect by us. With all other tiers of creation, cause equals effect. Inanimate, cause equals effect. You pick something up, that's a cause. The effect is up. If you throw something down, that's a cause. The effect is going to crash down. With plant life, this applies. You place a seed of an orange in a fertile ground, that's the cause. The effect is an orange tree is going to bud out. Not an apple tree, not a rose garden, an orange tree. Cause and effect. No changing path from cause to effect. So long as all the conditions of the cause are met, then the effect is inevitable. With the animal kingdom, that's also true. The day the calf is born, a calf in 20 years time frame from that day he was born is still going to be a cow or an ox. Either plowing the field, acting aggressively, or producing milk, or nursing its babies or whatever the term is. Cause and effect. There's nothing they could do about it. But when it comes to us, cause does not equal effect. As we discussed in the Tanya class, for the Maharal of Prague, when Hashem says, Naaseh Adam b'Tzelmeinu, let us make mankind in our image, who's us? Hashem should have said, I'm going to make mankind in my image, because that's the direct implication. Who's us? There are many commentaries on this, but one that we discussed was that who's us? Both you and me. I'll give you the framework, but it's up to you to develop it. Us is you and me. By humans, and specifically us, am krovo. Cause does not equal effect. Cause, as we discussed in many classes, is all boils down to Hashem. All causes. He's the cause of all causes. All causes boil down to God. That's the framework that Hashem gives us, the cause. Whatever that cause is, whether it's a spouse, it's a reality, an experience, whatever that is, parents, all that is from Hashem. But that does not need to automatically result in the effect that is perceived by the naked and animal egocentric eye, by external vision. But that rather we need to view the cause from an internal perspective. This is God. This is God, as we discussed last week. Then this must be good. Not if. Being that this is God. I'm sorry, I misspoke. Being that this is God and God's doing, then this must be good. If it's not flowing correctly, it means my perception and my responses to the cause are not accurate. And the more inaccurate the perception and the response are, to the point that a response is not a response, it's just a reaction because the person is viewing it from the external, then the more incongruency and intentions and so on and so forth is going to build. As the Talmud says, Hashem says to the Jewish people, I don't come with you to you with overwhelming demands. In other words, what Hashem will give us could never overwhelm us. So on the other hand, we say, but wait a second, we see so many people are wallowing underneath the loads and the burdens of their lives. How could you say that? How could the Talmud say such a statement? While we have every right and obligation to daven to Hashem, to bring Mashiach immediately, and to sweeten all the judgments. Because after all, we're not living in the time of the biblical time, nor the time of the first or the second temples, etc., etc. Hashem can't be petty with us. Hashem's not petty. The times when we see open miracles and so on and so forth, there's a case. There's a case to say, but look, you're seeing, you're experiencing. How can you act so incongruently? As Levi Yitzchak Berdichev, the great defender of the Jewish people, once pleaded to Hashem, you cannot have any tightness over the Jewish people. You cannot have any sort of arguments against the Jewish people. For what reason? Because had you put yourself in an openly, in a manifest manner, into reality, and kept the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, and all of its doings in a book, in a philosophy, then you would have a complaint against them. But you did just the opposite. You put the Yetzer Hara in all of its elements in an open, manifest, in our faces manner, and yourself you insert it into a book. What kind of a complaint do you have against us? So Hashem cannot be petty with us right now. So the people say that, oh, I'm being punished, and this is no. The Torah openly says that if someone's going through temporary insanity, or is insane, or incapable of understanding, for example, a child, the reason why a child is not obligated in mitzvot until 12 for a girl or 13 for a boy, is because they don't have the capability of truly understanding. When a person is essentially incapable of understanding, then they are exempt from the mitzvot. And as we discussed last week, this entire generation has been deemed already for over 100 years as a tinok shenishba, a baby that's been kidnapped and raised by wolves. My son my oldest son, who was a rabbi in Ukraine, it's a very famous orphanage, told me that one of the children that was brought to the orphanage is a child that was literally found in the forest. His parents dropped him off in the forest, most probably as an infant or close to being an infant, and he was literally raised in the forest by animals. When he was brought in, he growled like an animal. He didn't speak. He didn't communicate. He ate and walked like Tarzan. But this was real. Should the child be a, a law-abiding, contributing citizen? Yes, of course. But could you practically expect that? No. Who taught him? What was the circumstance of his life that we have that such an expectancy from him? It would be, as a matter of fact, unfair and setting him up for failure to expect him to be in such a way where he wasn't raised this way. If this is true for a human being, and we as human beings can understand that, obviously Hashem understands that. Hashem is not petty with us. The truth is, whatever Hashem gives us is only for our benefit. Obviously, there's the direct spiritual benefit to all of us, to Hashem, to Am Yisrael, to the world. But ultimately, it's for our benefit. It's like a healthy, how much more so, holy parent does not raise their child based on their own needs or their own needs that are born of their standards, while each parent wants to endow their children with healthy and holy standards and frameworks and so on and so forth. But we do not raise our children based on them. Rather, we have to raise our children based on their own individual, unique needs. Hashem does not overwhelm us with demands, but rather it gives each and every one of us exactly what we need in order to accomplish what we're here to accomplish, as we discussed many times. What can and will overwhelm a person, and what has traditionally overwhelmed people, is their lack of perceptive, the lack of perspective. How much more so the lack of perception? From this lens, we could understand and we must understand and internalize that whatever we have in our lives is not there to overwhelm us, but rather to elicit from us our very essence, as we already discussed in the last few weeks. And this is how we understand the period of the 9 days. The morning of the 3 weeks, but specifically to the period of the 9 days, which we're coming up to this week, from Rosh Chodesh onwards. That Hashem is not saying because you cried as an infant for nothing, I'm going to overwhelm you throughout history to cry for something. It's not like, God forbid, a mean-spirited parent saying to their child, "Oh, you cry for nothing. I'll give you something to cry about." Oh, God forbid. Not only that's unholy, that's unhealthy. That's not parenting. That's pettiness, destructive pettiness at that. But rather, Hashem is telling us, look, you're going to go through situations, both collectively and individually throughout history. And if your go-to is crying, what is crying? Chassidus explains that crying, when tears are created and literally pour out from our eyes, is indicative that the meichin, that the intellect cannot withstand the signal that's coming in. It's overwhelmed. If that's your go-to, overwhelming, and everything that brings, you're setting yourself for a life of misery, and not just individually, collectively. Not this is a decree, but this is not your go-to. You're going to cry and you're going to get angry and this and that for what? How is that going to help? And we discussed in the Tanya class how many times we see that people, unfortunately, as not even realizing, go to this type of approach for self-soothing. They cry themselves to sleep, self-pity, woe is me. This is not why Hashem, why'd you do this for me? Hashem, save me. This is all like, it's self-soothing. And we discuss the psychology of that. But that's certainly not productivity, and that's certainly not holiness. There is a time to cry, yes. But that's not the approach to resolving the situation. But most people go to that, either sadness or anger or anxiety and so on and so forth, shutdowns and offense and defense. And that's their final frontier. No, you already said that and you already did that and I'm already upset and that's it. That's the end. Nothing else. Hashem says, how is crying going to help you? In the Soviet Union, especially in the peak, the 20s, the 30s, 40s, Reb Chaim Fagin, Yechezkel Fagin, was for bringing with the students, the Tmimim, in a secret clandestine for bringing. So it's forbidden for more than 3 people to congregate for the sake of spirituality or anything, because all of that would be deemed like counter-revolutionary. You must be conspiring. So when such forbringings occurred, and the KGB got word for it, they would set out a hunting party like almost like with dogs. Where is this forbringing? Because if Jews are getting together, especially Schneersonists are getting together, it's only to defy us. So once such forbringing, the Chatzar Fagin was forbringing with the students. And one of the students who was on the lookout outside came barging in and says the KGB got word that there's a forbringing and they're going door to door looking. So immediately all the students dispersed. Very interesting, but the topic of the Farbrengen was serving Hashem earnestly and honestly, in davening and learning in Ahavat Yisrael, etc., etc. And Reb Chaim was speaking to the students that your service is inaccurate. You're not sincere enough. You're not refined enough. Now, obviously, these were very refined, very sincere students. But the more refined, the more sincere, the more you see how much more there is to go. So they took these words and they in the course of the Farbrengen, especially you take a Chaim and everything penetrates so much more deeper. And they started crying. But then the KGB, the word of the KGB coming home, looking from house to house for this Farbrengen, they got word of it and they dispersed. At the next Farbrengen, Chaim started it with a question. I don't understand. When we spoke about the need to further refine yourself, etc., you cried. When you heard about the KGB coming, you didn't cry. Over there, you immediately got up and ran. Why didn't you cry? It wasn't a rhetorical question. It was a real question. So one of the students responded, Rebbe, well, how would crying help us in that situation? Just sit there and cry until the KGB walked in. How would that help? Chaim says that's exactly my point. Crying because of lack of service is not going to result in anything good. Action. What are you doing about it? Do something, anything, but do something. This is what Hashem was telling us. You're crying, and how is that going to help you historically? As a matter of fact, as we discussed, all of the entire historical aspect of Tisha B'Av and all of its implications, Rahman al-Islam, began because the Jewish people cried on Tisha B'Av when we heard the false report. But where does that come from? In the report itself. We were grasshoppers in our eyes, and so too were grasshoppers in their eyes. The Kosker Rebbe explains this. How do we know how we looked in their eyes? There's no Torah pasuk, there's no verse in Parashat Shlach that indicates that we heard the giants call us grasshoppers. And the verse doesn't say that we heard them say this, but rather we were grasshoppers in their eyes. How do we know how they viewed us? Okay, so we were tiny compared to them. But how do we know? I mean, physically tiny. How do we know that that they viewed us as grasshoppers? But the Kosker Rebbe explains that actually emanated from our own self. We were projecting this because we're grasshopper in our own eyes. We projected it onto them. Insecurity isn't just a psychological issue. It has a cosmic implication, both collectively and, of course, individually. Someone who's insecure as to who they are and what are they here for, they're going to be overwhelmed by everything they see, because everything they see is too much for them. They're going to cast doubts on who they are, what they're here to accomplish, if it's all accomplishable, and then move from living to surviving. And every aspect of their life is going to be about survival. Minimal, bare minimum. Whether it's their shalom bayit, raising their children, self-care, communal affairs, et cetera, et cetera. It's all going to be minimalistic. Where there are certain aspects that less is more. That's when it comes to our corporality. Whatever we need, even if it includes luxury. But it has to be a need in order to serve Hashem. It has to be accurate. But anything else is excess. When it comes to Yiddishkeit, spirituality, et cetera, character work, the more, the better. Obviously, it has to be done in a framework, in a healthy and holy way. Because sometimes that in itself, although the trend is absolutely truth, if it's done inaccurately, that could also be very destructive. But nevertheless, we are here to serve. And that service, just like a father doesn't raise his children based on his own need, rather based on the children's need. The service that Hashem gives us is ultimately for our own need. But specifically, there's a talk in 1989, summer of 1989. I'm sorry, 88. The Rebbe makes a completion on the laws of damages in the Rambam. And the laws of damages concludes with a ship that took sail. And in midst of the sail, a storm breaks out, and the captain finds it necessary to throw all the cargo overboard in order to allow the ship not to sink. In order to save lives. Question over there, is a captain now liable to pay for the damages of the lost objects that he threw overboard? As we know that there is a concept of what's called the rodef, the pursuer, someone who pursues chas v'shalom to hurt, maim, or someone else's life. Being that our lives supersede the majority of the mitzvot, and one is allowed to defend themselves, and not only allowed, they must defend themselves in order to preserve their lives. And not held liable for the damages that it caused the pursuer. So we deem the cargo the pursuer. That the weight of the cargo would chas v'shalom, in such a state, a tremendous storm, chas v'shalom contribute to the opposite of life. There's a lot to speak about that. The Rebbe takes it, of course, into the depth of it, as we discussed, that each part of the Torah has two tiers. There's the body, there's the legality, the mechanics, et cetera, the narrative, and of course, there's the soul, the spiritual DNA. Says the Rebbe, this is an allegory to the soul in the time of exile. And the storm of exile, the captain of the ship, which is God, threw over the cargo. What's the cargo? The mitzvot. As we know, we have 613 biblical mitzvot and 7 rabbinical mitzvot, as well as all their offshoots, the derivatives. But out of those mitzvot, only 20% are available in the time of exile. On the surface level, that is because a lot of our mitzvot are intertwined and tied into the Jewish people having the land of Israel, not from a political perspective, but from a biblical perspective. Having the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple, et cetera, et cetera. So because we don't have the Beit HaMikdash in Israel, although Baruch Hashem, as we discussed many times, especially the Rebbe spoke about this many times, although Israel should not be conducted by politics, or rather a monarchy, specifically the monarchy of the Davidic dynasty, specifically in Mashiach. Nevertheless, we have to guard Israel and all of its inhabitants, because after all, the Rebbe said this is the miracle that after 2,000 years we received Israel back. But it's up to us to make it the land of Israel, not the state of Israel. Not to pretend that Israel is 78, 80, 90, 100, 120 years, 300 years, 500 years, 1,000. No. That God forbid minimizes it. It trivializes it. When we come from that perspective, we have all the pushback. But nevertheless, with having said this, 80% of the mitzvot are unavailable to us. Why? So from the lens of what we discussed before of the ship that took sail and encountered a tremendous storm, and the captain overthrew the cargo overboard in order to protect the lives of the passengers. So too, when exile began, the storm started raging. Hashem threw over the cargo, the mitzvot, in order to lighten our burden, and only retain the mitzvot, which are absolutely imperative for our essential well-being and within our capabilities of connecting to God on that level throughout the time of the exile as it gets dark and gloomier. And from this perspective, we have to understand that every mitzvah that Hashem gives us, and sometimes it might press us to our core, but that's the purpose, to reveal our core. Nevertheless, it's for our benefit. And as we discussed many times, often when we have a pushback, an external pushback, how much more an internal pushback, resistance, that's only indicative of how pertinent this particular mitzvah is for us. This is where we this mitzvah is what we shine extra in. This is our portal which raises up all of our mitzvot, raises us in all of our mitzvot. And this is what Hashem was saying. Why are you crying? You're crying for nothing. Do you understand? And this is your approach to life. You're setting yourself and everything about you for misery. Not that I'm condemning you, God forbid. But your approach is condemning you. And finally, regarding this piece, we discussed something very powerful. Why do we refer to this time frame from Rosh Chodesh Menachem Av to Tisha B'Av, after Tisha B'Av, after Tisha B'Av, as the 9 days, the Tisha Yamim? From a Hasidus perspective, we know, as Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya, the soul contains within its makeup the 10 powers. 3 intellectual faculties, Chokhmah, Binah, V'Dat, the right brain, the left brain, and the middle brain. Then the 7 emotive attributes, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferet, etc. All the way down to Malchut. Each faculty and each attribute has its own type-specific purpose, function, and mannerisms. Its own way of streaming the light of the neshama. As we discussed in the Sfirat Omer classes, as well as the Tanya class. The reference to this time period as the 9 days is referencing to the cause of the 9 days. That they're 9 and not 10. And Sefer Yitzirah, the book of creation, which is the oldest Kabbalistic book there is. It was given from Hashem to Adam, contains the secrets of creation. And was committed to writing by Avraham Avinu and transmitted from generation to generation. Sefer Yitzirah says in holiness, everything is 10 and not 11, 10 and not 9. Ten is the perfect number. It's a whole number. Basar ma'amaros nivra olam, as the Mishnah tells us. And 10 utterances Hashem created the world. And as the Midrash tells us, those 10 utterances are intertwined with the 10 commandments to the extent that Hashem made a Tanai. He made a condition with the 10 utterances. The Jewish people will accept the Torah when I give it to them 2,448 years from now. The 10 commandments, then I will continue you. But if they don't, I'll revert you back to nothingness. Because as we know, Bereshit bara Elokim es neshama v'sa'aretz. And it's brought down by one of the commentaries and the Zohar, etc., etc. Bereshit What's Reshit? Reshit is a head. So one of the comments says, Bereshit, with the head, with Chochmah, Hashem created the world, with the attribute of wisdom. Another is for what's called Reshit, which is Torah. Hashem created the entire world for the Torah. The number 10 is reoccurring over and over throughout the Torah. Regarding 10 and 9, 11, we discussed that we do find in the Torah one item that's 11. The incense offerings has 11 spices. And we discussed the significance of this. If everything in holiness is 10 and 9, 11, then how come we find spices 11? We discussed this. 10 and not 9, this is a deficiency. 10 and not 11, 11 is there to counter the 11th aspect, which is will, which is encompassing the person. Whereas by the intellect is within the frame of the person, within his brain, within his head. Will is an encompassing element. And in order to counter the animal soul's will, which is very powerful, there's 11 spices. That's a positive. When it comes to 10 and a 9, 9 would be a negative. Hence, we have the Tisha Yamim, the 9 days. What is the 9 days? That's 9 attributes missing one. And as the Rebbe explains, those are the 9 attributes from Chokhmah, from wisdom, from the first of the 3 intellectual faculties, all the way down to Yesod. But missing the femininity, the receptacle to which the Talmud says, Adam hu lo Adam, a man is not a man if below bait, without a house. A man is not considered a man if he doesn't have a house. What's a house? His wife. It means he's not a man. Or he's not biologically a man. So what is he until he gets married? The meaning is, a man is here to conquer. Not conquer with spears or guns or anything like that. Not talking about global domination, as the world calls it, but rather to conquer the worldliness. Transform the worldliness to be an hospitable abode for Hashem. But for this to happen, he needs a wife. Because the nature of the man, the masculine soul, is retraction. It's yud. As the Rabbi Rashab explains in a foundational discourse, which was actually connected to last week's parsha, Hechalzu. In English, it's called An Ahavat Israel. It was said in 1898. And the Rabbi Rashab repeated it several, and Hayom Yom is brought down. There's several, that every one of the Rebbeim had a particular discourse that they would repeat over and over in order to purify the world, etc., etc. And this Hechalzu is specifically one of those discourses. The entire point of it is strife. What strife does. And the entire purpose of this is to show where it comes from and how to overcome it, transform it. It's a very deep discourse, very deep. It's very long. It's pretty long as well. However, the Rebbe over there brings Havem b'chochma. Understand within wisdom. And paradox in chapter 23, the Rebbe brings over there Hachkem bevina. Wisen up with bina, with understanding, in understanding. What's the difference? Understand in wisdom, Havem b'chochma, is exactly what the wife does for the husband. Husband being a yud, a letter yud, is a seminal point. As we discussed many times, every single letter, the Hebrew alphabet, begins with a yud and finishes with a yud. It's just extended. To look at the Torah in the actual writing, or even in our Siddur, so on and so forth, you'll notice that every letter begins with a yud. That's the seminal point. It's the woman who draws out the yud and develops into a hey. Height, width, and depth. That's a hey. 3 lines. Well, 2 lines and 1 yud in the middle. It's the woman who develops this. And the Rebbe Rashab explains over there that if it wasn't for the woman, the yud wants to altogether go out of existence. As Alter Rebbe explains in Tanya, that's the Pintele Yid. The flame in itself wants to abandon the wick, knowing that it's going to go out of extinction. It's going to go out of existence. Why does it want this? So that's the reason why it rises up. That's why the reason it sees, because it wants to escape the wick, to revert back to the source of the fire of under the moon. So too, the yud essentially doesn't want to exist. It wants to completely and utterly negate, be nullified and absorbed back into a source. What gives the yud even its minimal frame, minimal form, is havem b'chokhmah. That within chokhmah there has to be a measure of bina. Because otherwise, if there's no even a drop of bina in this chokhmah, there will be no yud, there will be nothing. And we see even in psychology, we discuss it in our marriage class, that the woman's intersocial disposition is quite the opposite of a man's. A woman, God forbid, lo alenu, we should never know this. If she outlives her husband, she could have a normal life. She'll go up with her friends and have social engagements and this and that. A man left to his own device will become a hermit. Or as man from Mars and woman from Venus explains that when a man feels not valued and so on and so forth, he retracts back to his cave. It's proverbial cave. Havem b'chokhmah, I'm sorry, Hachkem bevina, but wisen up in Bina, that's hearts of silence. that the hay, the feminine mystique, it's a mystique for men, because a woman could have 1,000 different polarizing direction in one shot in her head, because that's bina. That's a process of pregnancy. Taking every single cell, this one should be here, and this one should be, and this one should be like this, and it's all happening in one shot. It's chaos. A woman could think one direction and at the same time understand completely, and there could be complete contradictions. But that's the feminine. What the husband gives to the wife is the chokhmah, is the wisdom. To this, Rabbi Rashab says, you gave Avram a hay, you place a hay in his name, and you found his heart to be loyal to you, before you. What does this mean? The hay, as we discussed, is binah. Once binah is active, it could go not stop. We can understand this way, but we can understand this way. And then, by the way, based on this way, there's a million other ways to understand it this way. In other words, the process never stops. Nothing comes to a full resolve. The yud inside the hay, the chupchik, represents what the male contributes to the woman. A point of resolution. With all of what you thought about, everything, you have to come up to one particular point. This is from below to above and above to below. Adam lo adam below bait means if a man doesn't have that, the wife, then he's going to retract. Then every one of his powers of conquering the world, we're not talking about God forbid, a military campaign or a global political campaign of any sort, God forbid. As you said, so we're talking about, from the lens of Torah, that we're here to sublimate the worldliness, refine the physicality and corporality of the world. For that, a man needs to know who he is, and that's what the wife does. But more than that, the wife reveals, just like in conception, the wife reveals that the code in the seminal drop contain an entire human being. And although under a microscope, and to those who have the understanding and the discernment, they could see all of life in that seminal drop. But at a practical level, it's not a human being. It's potential. It's the woman that actualizes her husband. Which gives expression to the husband. And the more fluid that connection is, the more the potential comes out from potential and begins to actualize in depth and depth. So the Rebbe explains at the beginning of that year, and I think we spoke about this a week or 2 weeks ago, the first discourse of that year, 1898, Yom Tov Shel Rosh Hashanah Shel Chal Yos B'Shabbos. The point of that discourse, and henceforth there's a series of discourses that finish in the Hanukkah, is the concept of Malchut, Gvura, Bina, and Gvura, speech. That speech isn't just expressing what's in the mind or in the heart, but through speech, one is able to probe into the essence of the thought, the essence of the emotions and amplify it to height, width, and breadth. To the extent that when you're delivering an intellectual idea, a concept, the teacher might have the idea already formulated in their mind, but the more they discuss it, the deeper their understanding, the more they reveal even elements that they weren't even aware that they understood. When it comes to the emotions, the more we speak an emotions, the more amplified it becomes, the deeper it becomes, the more passionate it becomes. And that's to the positive, and conversely the opposite. The wife doesn't just reveal what was in the external of the husband. She reveals the essence that the husband's not even aware that he has. And it's not by force. It's through their union, through their fluid connection that reveals things within the husband that he wasn't even aware that he's capable of. But in each and every one of us, we have both the masculine and the feminine. The masculine part of each and every one of us are the three intellectual faculties and the 6 emotive faculties until Yesod. Malchut, royalty, as Tikkunei Zohar says, Malchut peh Torah sheba'al peh. Malchut corresponds to mouth, to speaking. To revealing. What is Malchut? That's the feminine aspect. It receives from all the 9 attributes and reveals them into width, height, and breadth, giving them every type of expression necessary in order for them to achieve what they need to achieve. What is Malchut? As we discussed in the Sfirat HaOmer classes, Malchut, kingdom, is governmentship. To reign over your life. A king could break through boundaries and no one is allowed to stop him. A king could uproot mountains with his words because he's a king and his words have power. Not that he physically goes and uproots mountains, his words, he says, he said and it was. Royalty within us is intertwined, not intertwined. Royalty within our psychological self, and of course our spiritual psychological self, is intrinsic self-worth and personal competence. Because you're valuable, essentially. Because you matter and your behaviors matter essentially. Then every part of you must be given expression. Every holy, positive, good, that is essentially tied to you as a Jew, as a person, and your role from Judaism, whether it's being a father, a mother, a husband, a child, whatever it is, a colleague, a boss, all of that must be given healthy and holy expression. For what? That I'm good. And if I'm good, then my intellect has to be revealed. My chesed, my gevurah, and so on and so forth. Without this, without malchut, without intrinsic self-worth, then personal competence becomes nothing more than a defense mechanisms. That's where you see people becoming perfectionists in work and looks and this and this. We discussed it in our parenting class, that a child who's missing intrinsic self-worth, you'll see it very quickly. They're going to latch on to externalities as their definitions. Their hairs, their clothes, everything has to be perfect. If sports, they want to be the top athlete, whatever it is. Nothing wrong with you know being the best you can, but the question is, what's the driver? Who's the driver? When it comes from intrinsic self-worth, it's organic and is wholesome because it encompasses the entire person. When it comes from externality, you're only going to latch onto a very external element of the person, and it's going to drive that to be the best. But what does it have to do with you? All right, this is important, but what does it have to do with you? And if it, as we discussed last week, if it leaves out parts of you, and certain parts of you are not part and parcel of this growth, if there's a part of you still in jail and you're not paying attention to it, then essentially your entire self is in jail. And if you could have produced all this while still being in jail, how much more so if you're out? But if it's coming from an external part, all it's going to do is develop externality, which is going to give the facade that you're productive in this, but internally you're not, and you're going to feel it. You're going to start feeling, as we discussed several weeks ago, you're going to start feeling an emptiness. And it's not because this life, this marriage, this work is not for you, as we discussed last week. Perhaps you're doing it wrong altogether. The 9 days references to the exact dilemma, the source of the dilemma, that we were missing malchut, that we're missing royalty, pride in who we are. We're God's chosen nation. We're the ones that are sent into this world to transform the worldliness to become a hospitable place for Him. Again, imagine a queen or a prince who start dressing and acting and speaking like a pauper. Obviously, we could understand how that disrupts the king and his governmentship. While the other 9 faculties and attributes could be 100% astute and powerful, if there's no malchut, all of those are going to retract, and obviously not going to be given proper expression in one's life. And even if it's successful, it's only a drop of what they could accomplish. For that reason, the very first, even from a psychological perspective, focus on the child is to develop the intrinsic self-worth and their personal competence. Because without this, it's a life of chaos. One day yes, one day no, one day I'm in the mood, one day I'm not in the mood, etc., etc. It's flimsy. And then after a while, if it's flimsy, then the person will become overwhelmed. Not because they can't, but they're not tapping into the powers that they need to. Because they don't have that drive of malchut, which gives expression to everything. Give me 1 second, please. That's the definition of exile. By definition, as we discussed many times, when the Aleph is not revealed in the Golah, leaving it as Golah instead of Geula. That's the master of the world. That's the revelation that there's a master in this world. That's the concept of Shekhinah Begalusa. That's the concept of Shekhinah is in Galut, of exile. In other words, the Sfira of Malchut, which is Shekhinah, is in exile. It's trapped. As we discussed in a couple of weeks ago, the difference between Avraham's brother Haran and his next incarnation, Aharon, both of them were in the middle, both in the spelling of their names and as well as their character style. The difference was Aharon had the Aleph in before everything, before the Hey, before the Reish, and before the Nun, the Aleph Shel Olam. He knew who he was and he knew what he was here to do. But when the Aleph is not defined, then taking the middle path is not exactly being balanced as much as being pacifist, a form of escape. Maybe, maybe not. We'll try this. If that doesn't work, oh, we'll do something else. This is what's the 9 days. Is there to remind us of the source of all the suffering. Suffering is not, God forbid, a decree. Galut is not a decree. It's an opportunity. But the opportunity could come in one of two ways. As we discussed many times, including the tests and trials and tests and tribulations, is there to elicit your Pintele Yid, your essence, your real self to come out from hiding, from captivity. But without this, all there is captivity. And for the most part, it's self-imposed. This is what the time period we're here now, as we discussed already in the last week's classes, that the entire union of Bein HaMetzarim between the straits originates in the divine strait, which is essence above creation. But if it's not giving an expression, if it's not giving a holy and healthy, consistent manner to stream, then this instead of creating a geula, a redemption, a reality of redemption, it creates a overwhelming. Not because Hashem is overwhelming us, but rather we are not like it's like the husband has what to offer, but the wife is not receiving. It creates chaos in the home. If we don't accept who we are, what we're here to do, holistically, then we're setting ourselves for a life of misery. It's not what we wanted, rather what we're wanted for. It's not what I need. Well, I need to do this and this and then. No. That's a defense mechanism. Negotiation is all good and fine. But Yiddishkeit is predicated on Asav Nishma. We'll do. Then we'll think about it. Then we'll talk about it. First, we're committed to do, no matter what. No matter when, no matter where. Otherwise, it's flimsy. Well, this time I understood, so I'm really excited about it this time because I understand I really like it, so I'm going to do it. Now that I understand that eating not kosher is not beneficial for me, now I'm going to keep I'm going to keep kosher. But until then, I don't expect. Obviously, we understand that's flimsy. If we don't organically and holistically accept who we are and what we're here to accomplish, that it's not self-imposed, this mission. It's not man-made, but rather it's a divine relationship that transcends all of time and space, but is meant to be drawn down and revealed in the nitty-gritty of time and space. This is how Mendel was able to retain his sanity, knowing that before he was arrested, he served God, and now that he's arrested in Siberia, he's serving God. This is what we mentioned, the father who would come home and say, Baruch Hashem Shabbos, knowing that he lost his job, knowing that he's in debt, knowing that the next week is God-given. Not a horrible twist of circumstances. That he would love to serve God, but not in this situation. It's impossible. This is what we learned several weeks ago. Kol Marich Be'echad, or anyone who extends the Echad in Shema. Aleph into the Chet, 7 firmaments and this lowly world in which the neshama travels down to. It's not to polish buttons, not to sew buttons. And the Dalid, the four directions, that this applies in all times and all spaces. And that's our aim. So whether it's the father who comes back home on Erev Shabbos, knowing what he knows, to being told what he was told by his boss, or any other of these examples, this is a service. The service is to draw this in this situation. Not if it wasn't for the situation, then of course. But now the situation happened, cause and effect, there's nothing I could do about it. If God would change the situation, or if I was stronger enough or better or whatever it is, the situation is right now. You want to develop more, Baruch Hashem, develop. Don't stop. But right now, you have to take action. You, the real you, has to take action. Not the caricature of yourself. As we discussed already several times, the word depression is depressed. When the body can no longer manage the caricature that the person became. As a need to defend or offend. The body and the soul are shidduch. If in a marriage, the husband or the wife warps to the point that this is not the same person, then as we discussed many times, the other spouse has to ask themselves, am I doing what I need to do? If it's a wife, am I being receptive to my husband? Am I showing him how valuable he is? Am I creating the fertile ground for his growth because his growth ultimately, as we discussed many times, in turn has to put her on a pedestal higher than him. But if that's not happening, there's a question: is it from below to above to below? And as we discussed in Shabbat, from the Torah's perspective, each side needs to take 100% responsibility. But that's shifting. Well, it's him, it's her. The main question: am I doing what I need to do 100%? Am I 100% immersed in this? Is it coming from the true me or from the escapist me? And often we'll find that the latter, unfortunately, is the case. The same applies within ourselves as well. Which, in turn, ends up at some point of having, God forbid, experienced our own personal Shiva Tammuz, where our walls are breached, our own standards that we recognize as being truthful are cracked either from the inside or outside. And incidentally, it's very important to point out over here. Yes. Tammuz tells us something very, very shocking. When were the walls of Yerushalayim, when were they cracked? When were they breached? When did the breach begin? Yeah, we know Shiva Tammuz, but what happens Shiva Tammuz? So, as a matter of fact, the enemies made a siege for some very long time. The siege was a very long time. But throughout that entire time, the Jews managed to have every single day 2 sheep hoisted over the wall, one of the walls, where there was a lapse of guards from where the enemies had a lapse of guards, and they were able to every single day bring to the Kohen would draw down a basket over the wall, and the one that they had to deal with, the Kohen would draw down a basket with money for 2 sheep, and the person would put 2 sheep inside the basket, and that was how we would give the Tamid offering, the continual offering daily. So it's as we had 2 weeks ago with Parsha. 1 sheep in the morning, 1 sheep towards in the late afternoon. When the general found out that this was happening, he realized that this was creating a protective barrier for the Jewish people, these offerings. So when he found out from the one who was supplying the sheep what was happening, he said, today let me take care of this. I want to handle this transfer. And instead of sheep, when the Kohen hoisted the basket down, a pig was put on inside the basket. And as the pig was being hoisted up, one of his hoofs struck the wall and everything started shaking. And that's when the breach began. There's a lot to be spoken about that on every single detail from this. But however, one particular point, that a Shivasa Tammuz, the 17th Tammuz, the Tamid offering stopped, leading to the breach of the walls and the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. As we discussed already several weeks ago, the Tamid, the continual offering 1 sheep in the morning and 1 sheep towards the afternoon, and towards the mid to late afternoon. We discussed several times already the significance of the sheep, but the continual framework In morning clarity, towards the evening, when there is already gloominess, the connection, the closeness, the offerings don't stop. Because the truth remains truth, notwithstanding any and every external condition. When that's gone, then everything else is a facade. Facts. Some facts can hold and some facts cannot. Depends on the circumstance. The same applies not just between a husband and a wife, as we said, between a person themselves, their own masculinity and their own femininity. And first and foremost, this reveals itself in the person as I am essentially important. I'm God's gift to the world. I mean, it's not just me, it's everyone. But each person needs to view themselves and obviously the others. If this is true about me, obviously this is true about everyone. I'm sorry, I misspoke, being that this is truthful about me. I'm Maslamite. This is true for everyone else as well. But when a person has that defined inside of them, I'm royal. But I'm the prince or the princess that the king sent to a far land in order to further the royal interests. And as we discussed months and months ago, that's how Yosef was able to retain his sanity and his holiness. But Yosef, as a Parsha Shmot says, Yosef haya b'Misraim, and Yosef was in Egypt. And enumerating the names of the tribes who came down to Egypt with Yaakov, when Yaakov descended to Egypt. Regarding Yosef, it says, Yosef haya b'Misraim, and Yosef was in Egypt. Rashi comes and says, well, we knew that already. The Torah told us this was in Egypt. What is it coming to innovate here? So the Rashi brings, who Yosef? This is the same Yosef, Asher, that tended to his father's sheep, the shepherd. Simplicity. Who Yosef Asher mabitzit kato. He's the same Yosef that remained righteous in Egypt. As when Yaakov was told that Yosef was alive, he was said Yosef is alive and he is a ruler in Egypt. And the commentary says he's a ruler of Egypt. Egypt is not ruling him. What's the name Yosef? You know, Rachel had her son Yosef. She gave him the name Yosef. Yosef li ben Acher. Hashem should add for me another son. On the surface level, it means that I have one. Hashem should, it's like a prayer. Hashem should give me another son. The Rebbe explains, Yosef li, Hashem should add for me, Hashem should add for me, or this is a service within ourselves to add for Hashem, ben, a son from the Acher, from the other. From someone who's acting as a stranger or seemingly foreign to his origins, estranged from his origins, to make that a ben, connected, essential. With all the explanation, the Zohar explains what that means and so on and so forth. The Alter Rebbe brings in Tanya, to take from the stranger and making a ben. That's our mission. But Yosef haya b'Misraim. Yosef was in Egypt. In other words, that didn't change the metropolis, the power, the potential exile that could have immediately overwhelmed him, tried immediately to overwhelm him when he was sold and brought into Egypt, not only did not, God forbid, diminish him, but he exponentially grew. And that in itself, when a Jew knows this, who he is or who she is, that in itself, just like Joseph, when he knew who he was and what his mission is here to do, as we discussed in previous classes, then even when he had all the rights to be angry and shut down and depressed and anxious of everything that happened to him naturally, and to stay up nights after nights plotting a revenge, not only he didn't, he was truly happy and successful, and attributed all of this because he says, "You are the arms that brought me here, but but it was Hashem that sent me here. You were just the mechanics," to his brothers. "You didn't do this to me. God did, because God needed me to come over here to go in front of you, so when the famine hits, I'll be able to take care of you." But there's obviously the localized aspect of it, and then there's the spiritual cosmos meaning to that. That's all of our souls. When you have that recognition, then no externality could, God forbid, overwhelm you. Not your borders, and certainly not your internal selves. And when that day-to-day offering, easy times, clear times, difficult times, gloomy times, when that stops, when our connection closest to Hashem, Korban Lashon Kiruv, and this looks in ourselves by disconnecting and separating the feminine to the masculine. The 9 powers, the 9 soul powers, from the receptacle, the malchus, which in simple language, the person lacks intrinsic self-worth. That their entire life will be nothing more than an escape. Not to discount anything good that they do, God forbid. But they could do so much more and transform. But because they don't know who they are, then every single thing, it becomes a calamity. Me against the world. And that's what Hashem was telling the Jewish people. Today you cried for nothing. Do you understand? If you had emunah and bitachon, you know that I brought you thus far. I carried you this entire time. I fed you, I bathed you, personally tending to you. Do you think I'll chas v'shalom abandon you? Do you think I'll throw you into a situation that's just to overwhelm you? God forbid. Where's your emunah bitachon, which stems from your true self? If you don't connect to the real you, and don't lead with that in any given situation, you're just setting yourself for a life of misery. Not because something is wrong, but because you don't understand how strong you are and who you really are. And these days, we're given the opportunity to fix this, to correct it. Especially the second week of the 3 weeks corresponds to Bina. without making any excuses, whether they're being justified spiritually, psychologically, mentally, or emotionally, practically. An excuse is just that, an excuse. It might excuse why the persons are not doing what they're doing, even it might be justified. But as we spoke about many times, who wants to be exempt from their purpose of life? This reason, it cannot be an excuse. Hamaisir can do right now. Tell the ones you need it. I love you. I care for you. Show it to them. Hoist them up. Raise them upwards. Because, as we discussed many times, from the Chinuch, the heart is drawn after activity. If you don't feel it's okay, act it. It's not faking it. You're revealing the truth, and then it'll come out. Be it. There was a chassid, a very prominent chassid by the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe, who was not just a astute chassid, but he was also a business person, interacted with many people, Jews, non-Jews alike, very successful. And once he was sitting in a Farbrengen with students, and he was reproofing them on their service, on what they need to work on. And one of the students replied brazenly, "Listen, how could you tell us this when we saw that you're shaking hands with another woman in the course of business?" The chassid replied, the explanation, he didn't do directly, it was this, but he didn't try to defend himself. Obviously, he didn't do anything wrong, but he didn't try to defend himself. What he did say, though, was, if this is how, to the students, if this is your lead, to look at what someone else is not doing or doing as your reference point, you'll never grow. So let us take ourselves as infinitely, let us endear ourselves, not to scratch our own backs, but take ourselves infinitely seriously, because we are infinitely important to Hashem. And every day, doesn't matter how good tomorrow is, today has to be good. Today. Hayom lasotam, as the Torah said, today to do them. We'll continue Yemir Hashem tomorrow. Tonight, we have a Tanya class. I'm thinking that we're going to get into the first aspect of what I wanted to learn with you today. But we'll see. But Hashem, come 8 o'clock. Come on, come all.
Rabbi, thank you for your time.
Thank you. Any questions?
Not from me.
Okay. Baruch Hashem.
Thank you,
Amen.
Rabbi. Thank you.